A flexible pawn advance, preparing to fianchetto the bishop and control the long diagonal, while inviting a hypermodern pawn structure. A mirroring response, this fianchetto creates symmetrical pawn structures, fostering a battle for central space and influencing the opposite bishop's diagonals. Establishing a kingside fianchetto aims to support the central pawn structure and prepare for queenside expansion. Developing the dark-squared bishop to its natural diagonal prepares a queenside castling possibility and applies pressure toward the center. Pushing the e-pawn seizes central space, potentially opening lines for the bishop and queen. Challenging the center directly, black opens lines and fights for central space, preparing for a dynamic middle game clash. Securing central influence and preparing a queenside expansion, this move contests black's pawn structure. Delaying central pawn development allows white more breathing room to control the center. Reinforcing central presence, nc3 prepares a d4 push, eyeing long-term pawn leverage. Solidifying the center's grip, this pawn push prepares for future expansion while reinforcing the king's safety. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing kingside development, this move embraces a flexible, positional approach. Reinforcing the d5 square, this knight begins a potential journey to a more active outpost or supports a central pawn advance. Preparing kingside castling while developing a piece towards the center maintains flexibility for further central pawn pushes or a queenside expansion. Developing this bishop to a more active diagonal, it aims to control central squares and support future pawn advances. Asserting central influence and aiming to dislodge black's knight, this maneuver injects immediate tension into the pawn structure. Securing the king's safety now allows black to contemplate central pawn breaks or developing attacking ideas. Elevating the bishop prepares to contest the central squares and potentially pressure black's kingside. Bringing the queen to a more active diagonal, preparing to support the center and potentially pressure white's queenside. Positioning the queen to support the d3 pawn and prepare for central pawn breaks, while also eyeing potential attacks on the kingside. Reinforcing the central pawn chain and preparing for potential queenside operations. Pioneering new territory on the kingside, white seeks to expand space and potentially launch an assault. Sacrificing tempo for a central outpost, this knight boldly challenges white's central control, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure. Exchanging the bishop opens the bishop's diagonal, potentially creating attacking chances against black's castled king. Capturing back creates an isolated pawn, potentially weakening the kingside pawn structure for future attacks. This pawn thrust aggressively probes black's kingside, aiming to dismantle its defenses and create attacking chances. Challenging white's knight outpost and creating a new central pawn island, this move seeks to disrupt the opponent's established structure. Unlocking the kingside is the aim, hoping to exploit the weakened pawn structure and pressure the monarch. Igniting the center, black opens lines and challenges white's knight's central dominion. Opening the center's d-file now grants control of vital squares and initiates a fight for central influence. Opening the c-file now promises active piece play for black, challenging white's central influence and potentially creating dynamic counterplay. Shattering pawn structure for open lines, white initiates a bold simplification, hoping to exploit black's exposed king. Reclaiming material, black immediately contests the central squares and seeks to activate the queen. Escorting the king to safety amidst the pawn storm, a pragmatic decision to avoid central complications. Suddenly, the center cracks open, potentially liberating pieces, but also creating vulnerabilities for your king. Reclaiming the initiative, this knight leap aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and create attacking chances on the kingside. Reclaiming central influence with the queen, this move aims to disrupt white's solid pawn structure and coordinate an attack. Securing the d-pawn, white aims to solidify their central control and prepare for a potential kingside attack with a more robust pawn structure. This aggressive pawn thrust disrupts white's central control and opens lines for black's rooks. Clearing the bishop frees the f-file for its queen, opening avenues of attack. Unleashing the kingside pawns suddenly injects dynamism, but it weakens the dark squares around your monarch. A bold repositioning, aiming to exploit the open lines created by black's pawn push and potentially targeting the queenside. Exchanging the knight opens the f-file, potentially unleashing powerful rook activity and creating dynamic play. Sacrificing the bishop opens up black's king and creates powerful attacking lines along the now unblocked diagonals. The king retreats, seeking respite from the immediate pressure, but this leaves the kingside more exposed. Asserting control over the central e-file, white aims to neutralize black's king's safety and exploit the open lines. A decisive exchange clearing the back rank for immediate king's safety improvements. The king now awkwardly occupies the open e-file, exposing its flank. This audacious repositioning aims to activate the queen on an open diagonal, eyeing white's somewhat exposed king and potentially disrupting pawn structures. Reasserting central presence, the bishop retreats to a more robust defensive posture, safeguarding key squares. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure offers protection, though it concedes important squares to white's bishop. Securing the king's safety, white repositions to navigate the tense central pawn structure and prepare for future piece development. The bishop now finds a comfortable home, eyeing the white king's defenses. Securing the king's escape route by shifting it from the central pressure feels like a prudent, albeit passive, consolidation. Fortifying the bishop to contest the e5 square and improve its defensive posture. Consolidating the king on the light squares offers a safe haven and prepares for further central maneuvering. Black repositions the bishop, aiming to activate it on the long diagonal and contest control of the central squares. Securing the queen's influence on the queenside now allows for potential pawn advances. Asserting presence on the queenside, this pawn advance aims to disrupt white's maneuvering space and potentially create an outpost for black's pieces. Shifting the monarch to safety, a prudent retreat from potential skirmishes on the kingside. Consolidating the queen to the queenside prepares a potential queenside advance, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure. Clearing the file for potential rook activation, seeking dynamic counterplay on the queenside. Asserting control of the open c-file is paramount for black's counterplay. Consolidating control of the queenside, this square occupation seeks to disrupt black's central pawn structure. Shifting the bishop to c5 aims to create a passive blockade and challenge white's central control. Securing the central e-file, white aims to regroup and challenge black's imposing bishop. This pawn push secures the bishop's outpost, but weakens the queenside pawn structure significantly. Clearing the back rank opens a vital pathway for the rook's re-entry into active play. Relocating the king back to a safer square, a sensible precaution given the bishop's aggressive presence on the long diagonal. Unleashing the rook to a forward outpost, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and target the king's safety. Black's pawn advance aims to disrupt white's queenside control, opening diagonals for future counterplay. A brilliant lightning strike, shattering black's pawn shield and exposing the king to a swift checkmate. The queen's sacrifice dramatically simplifies the position, aiming for a swift mating attack against the exposed king. Initiating an endgame, king confrontation, and rook activity for white's decisive advantage. The black king, now exposed after the rook exchange, faces immediate pressure along the newly opened 7th rank. A decisive pawn advance, finally opening up attacking lanes toward the enemy king. Initiating a strategic retreat of the king to a safer square, clearing the path for potential counterplay. Controlling the open file now becomes paramount as white's rook claims it. Reclaiming the central files offers a chance to consolidate black's position. Unleashing the bishop to eye the weak kingside pawns and threaten a powerful kingside invasion. The rook's relocation to the 7th rank aims to restrict white's king and create dynamic play on the open file. clears the king's final path with a precise exchange. The bishop retreats, sacrificing critical central influence for defensive stability. Clearing the diagonal opens a new avenue for the bishop to support the pawn advance. Unveiling the king from its safe harbor, black seeks to activate this dormant piece. Capturing the pawn simplifies to an endgame where white's rook has little to do. Pushing this pawn forward opens a potential escape square for the king while simultaneously contesting central space. Repositioning the monarch to safety from potential checks on the file is a prudent defensive measure. Pushing the king forward opens avenues for counterplay and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, though it exposes him to checks. Asserting control of the critical dark squares with the bishop solidifies the endgame advantage. Pushing the king forward attempts to activate it in the endgame, but leaves it exposed to potential checks. Relocating the king to the center aims to activate it for the endgame and contest central squares. Shifting the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to hinder white's passed pawn advance. Opening up the queenside can create crucial play on the queenside, or potentially lead to an even simpler endgame. Activating the bishop here, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and regain some activity. Shifting the king to the side allows the bishop to secure the queenside majority. The bishop seeks a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure white's isolated pawns. An opportunistic king hunt begins, exploiting the open diagonal to menace the enemy monarch and force concessions.